Good morning, Mr. Wright.
Good morning, my lady. Can I confirm that you can both see and hear us in the hearing room?
I can, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the first witness is Alex Skinner, if he could be sworn or take the affirmation. Thank you.
Please after me, please. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Skinner. You were formerly the Director of Local Government Funding at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Is that right?
That is right.
And you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry, which is INQ 000657743. Now, in terms of your role as Director of Local Government Finance, just first of all to understand what that really involves, was it a role that arranged for funding to be provided to local authorities so that they could continue to function and perform their functions of delivering services locally?
That's correct.
And so this is separate to the regime of business grant funding that the inquiries heard about. Is that right? That's funds being allocated by local authorities or delivered?
That is correct. So local government finance was primarily responsible for ensuring the financial sustainability of councils. Business grants was about supporting the business sector.
Okay, thank you. Now, we will look at both of those things during the course of your evidence, but can we start by looking at that funding to local authorities so that they could provide their services locally? And I'm going to ask, please, if the corporate statement of the department could be put up. So this is INQ 000652753 and paragraph 48. And we read there, the department did not have a ready-made pandemic plan with relation to local government finance. And I just want to pick up on that. Should we therefore understand there was no pre-existing pandemic finance plan?
So I think the best way to describe it was that we had done a significant amount of preparation for a shock to the local government finance system. We had what I would describe as the building blocks in place. We didn't have a plan in the sense of knowing exactly which of those building blocks we would deploy and at what time, and that reflected the uncertainty of the pandemic and the uncertainty of knowing in advance of a pandemic exactly which building block it would make sense to deploy and when.
I see. And so was there an ad hoc element to how things developed as between the department and local authorities within those parameters?
So I think there were questions about timing and exactly which levers we would pull. I think we had a very good understanding of broadly which levers we would pull and how we would support local government, because in essence you would be looking at income, expenditure, financial sustainability, and anybody who needed exceptional financial support. And you would also need to have a method for understanding that, which were the monitoring forms that we issued.
Yeah, and we'll come on to look at monitoring, which I think was something that was well established before the pandemic. Is that right?
You are right. So there is a whole plethora of monitoring which goes out to local government every year. So they are done quarterly and annually. I think the difference between what happened prior to the pandemic and what happened in the pandemic was we moved from that statutory quarterly and annual reporting to voluntary monthly reporting, and exactly what we asked for changed. So there were questions that were in the monitoring form that wouldn't have appeared in the statutory reporting.
I see. Well, we'll come back to monitoring as a subtopic. Generally, the evidence that the inquiry has received is of the broad view that the department, your department, engaged well with local government in terms of funding throughout the pandemic. Do you share that view?
Yes, I do share that view.
And why in particular is that your view?
So I think that we had for a long time significant engagement with the sector. So again, all of the elements which proved to be successful in the pandemic had been established prior to the pandemic. I think the big difference is where one was the intensity of the engagement. So prior to the pandemic, we might have spoken to government or local government maybe on a monthly or a weekly basis. Under the pandemic, we were talking to them on a daily and even multiple times a day. And I think the other thing that happened was a conscious decision on both sides, I think, to create a real spirit of openness and trust, which allowed us to discuss things with local government, which I think we hadn't previously been able to do.
Right. So two key things. One, the fact there were these pre-existing relationships that provided the channel for communication, followed by two, stepping up that communication and building true trust between the two partners,
Yes.
as it were, in the delivery of support. Okay. Can you just explain to us from your perspective and experience why certainty of funding is an important thing for local authorities?
So in normal circumstances, certainly funding is important because local authorities have a duty to obviously deliver all the services that they do, but also to do it in a way which represents value for money and is efficient and effective. And so certainty allows them to plan ahead, for example, to engage and take out contracts with providers and plan ahead. That is important in normal circumstances. In the pandemic, certainty of funding, I think, was more problematic because I think there was a tension at the heart of the pandemic, which was between value for money and the uncertainty about what would happen next in the pandemic. And the tension there was, for example, if we had given local government more certainty, then the risk would have been we would have given them more certainty on the basis of our understanding at the time we made the funding decisions that then turned out not to be true.
Can I just ask that we slow down slightly your answers?
I apologise.
No, don't worry about that. It's just that the stenographer needs to be able to keep up, and it's a natural thing to speak quickly. So just slow it down a little bit. Thank you. So in general times, normal times, certainty and clarity of funding you think is important, but the nature of the pandemic put stress on your ability to provide that clarity and certainty of funding. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. I think within the constraints that we were operating within, I think we did pretty much as we could have done to provide local government with certainty. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, I think ministers were very clear, and we as officials reflected that we would support local government from a financial perspective through the pandemic. One of the first things that we did in the pandemic was we provided cash flow support. That meant that no local authority had to worry that they wouldn't have enough money to provide the services. And then if you look at the sequence of support we then put in place, you had tranche 1 funding in March. That was 1.6 billion. And then you had tranche 2 funding in April. And the fact that we put the tranche 2 funding in so soon after tranche 1, I think, reflected the fact that what we were trying to do was to say to local government, you should get on with delivering the services. You shouldn't be worrying about where the money would come from. And the other part that ministers were very clear about was to say, we will use the monitoring form so that we can review the state of local government finance. And if there are issues, then we will look at it and review it and consider the case for more funding.
Okay. So, first of all, guaranteed cash flow. So that provides, does it, a safety net, if you like, that every local authority knows that the department is going to stand behind it if they run into cash flow problems. So they don't need to worry about disruption to services. Is that the point of guaranteeing cash flow?
So the immediate reason for providing the cash flow support was because very early in the pandemic, before the monitoring form, we were getting reports back from local government that they were concerned that the local government funding system, the lending between local authorities, was at risk of shutting down because local authorities were concerned about ensuring they had sufficient funding so they wouldn't lend to each other.
I see. And
over the course of a year, local authorities will lend to each other. Some will lend in one direction at the beginning of the year, others will lend in the other. And so the purpose of that was to ensure the liquidity of the system. There was enough cash in the system What we did later was to ensure the sustainability and the solvency of the system, which was about, do they actually have enough resources longer term to be able to provide the support they need to?
And you were trying to give them numbers early, is that the point?
Correct.
So that they knew what was coming and they weren't having to delay taking action in terms of delivery of service. They knew to a general degree what was coming and the volume of funds.
Absolutely. And as you got towards the end of the pandemic, if you look at Tranche 5, for example, that was first announced as part of the spending review in November, and that was funding for the first quarter of the year 21-22. So that was 4 months in advance. So that was, I think, a very sensible thing to do and provided local government with the certainty they needed.
Yeah. From the tone of your answers, it appears that you think that worked well. Looking ahead, would you do anything differently in terms of certainty and clarity and providing that certainty, or do you think you took the measures that you were able to take and they were the sort of measures that should be taken in a future emergency?
So in broad terms, I think they were right. I think what you could do is if you were looking at another pandemic situation, you could provide greater clarity. And I think David Phillips refers to this in his statement, to this idea that you could have a set of principles and an approach that you shared with local government. I think what you'd need to do is you need to ensure that when you provided that, you also were clear about the fact that the actual response would have to depend on circumstances of the time. But I think what that would do is it would say to local government, this is how we will think about your funding under a pandemic. And in essence, I think we did that under the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. I think if you were going forward, you could perhaps provide some people with just a little bit more comfort by setting that out as a set of principles.
So set out principles that everyone can see, they're accessible. They know the criteria by which you're judging the situation,
yes.
Essentially. All right. So can we move on to monitoring then, and monitoring by the Department of Local Authorities? And we're talking here, aren't we, about local authorities in England, and
Correct.
It's important to draw that distinction. I'd like to pick up during these questions the comparison with the position in Scotland. Now, you've told us there was regular monitoring, quarterly, I think you said, and that changed. The frequency changed, and is it right that also what you were asking for changed?
Yes, so there are statutory monitoring which has pre-existed the pandemic through a variety of forms. The monitoring form then was a different document, had some overlap with the statutory reporting, and then was initially monthly, and then later every 2 months.
Now, English local authorities, therefore, were used to an element of monitoring.
Correct.
To what extent did this change in frequency and the change in data you were requesting, in your view, add to the administrative burden on local authorities at a time when they were trying to deliver emergency services?
So I think we were acutely aware of the impact it would have, because in essence, every person you had filling out a form was not a person, as you said, who would be supporting delivery of services to the public. I think we worked very hard with the Local Government Association and with the sector in the design and refinement of the form. And I think we were also really clear why we thought it was important to have a form. I think local government also understood the value of the form because of the explicit link that was made between the monitoring form and the funding and the schemes that were put in place to support local government under the pandemic. And so I think while local government would have said there was a burden, I think they would have recognised that that was a burden that was worthwhile because of the benefits that the monitoring form provided to MHCLG, but also to other government departments.
So there was an inevitable trade-off in terms of increased administrative burden, but that resulted in you being able to deliver more effective support to the local authorities. So it worked both ways. Is that the point? And was there any dialogue back and forth between you as to whether it was too burdensome, or did you tend to find that you worked well in partnership with the Local Government Association and that, generally speaking, returns were made in a timely way and provided information you needed?
So I think it's been set out elsewhere that the response rate started at more or less 100%, and then even by the very end was still over 80%. So I think that reflects the fact that local government understood why we were asking for the information, and they were also prepared to give the information. I can't overemphasize how important the monitoring form was, and therefore, if anything, I would have liked to have seen a larger proportion even through to the end. But by the time we got to the very last monitoring forms, the pandemic essentially was winding down, and therefore I can understand why some local authorities would have said, actually, we've got other things that we need to prioritise now.
I mean, providing data for the sake of it would be burdensome without advantage. But can you give us an example of how you say how important it was to have this monitoring and how it assisted you in the department to assist local authorities in return? Can you give us a worked example of that where it made a real difference? Or
well, so the most obvious one is that it actually allowed us to understand broadly how much local government was spending. So as a rule of thumb at the beginning of the pandemic, from the monitoring forms that we were getting, we thought that local government was spending broadly in the region of £500 million a month. And so that allowed us to think about how much funding we should give, how frequently we should do it, and therefore what the combination of those would be. So that would be one example. The other would be at the very beginning of the pandemic, and you can see this through the development of the way the money was distributed, we had first understood the pandemic as a shock that came through the adult social care system. So the first funding that we gave was primarily aimed towards adult social care. What we then got back from the monitoring form was actually the pressures on income. And so when you look at the second tranche of money that we gave, that was then much more weighted towards supporting people with a loss of income. And then as the pandemic developed, we then changed from going through a purely formula-based approach to one where we had a formula-based approach for expenditure and then a claim approach for income, so tax and for sales fees and charges.
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry to interrupt. I think you mentioned how much local government was spending in the region of 500 million a month. It was recorded as billion. I just wanted to check. You said 500 million per month.
Yes, 500 million. And to be clear, that was just for the unring-fenced funding that we were providing from local government finance. Obviously, other departments and other actors were providing additional funding.
Yes, thank you, my lady. I'm sure that'll be corrected in the stenography. It's million, not billion.
It's definitely million.
Yeah, thank you. So there's obviously a balance to be struck, as you've said. Do you think that, by and large, you struck it well with English local authorities in terms of the level of monitoring that was required as against the benefits of that monitoring?
Yes, I do. I think if I were looking to the future, I think one thing that I would consider would be the number of departments, the number of actors who were doing monitoring. So could we as government take a more joined up approach and therefore streamline the amount of monitoring we were doing by centralising it more and then just asking one set of questions? That would obviously be more work. The single product would be more work for local government, but my aim would be overall that it would reduce the burden on local government overall, and potentially would also then help central government because you would have one data source telling you what was happening.
One interpretation of the data is that when you looked at the funding that was in fact provided to local authorities in England, there's an argument they were overfunded.
Yep.
During the pandemic. And I just wonder how that sits with the proposition that the monitoring was effective and assisted you to deliver the support.
So I think inevitably the difference between the statutory monitoring and the monitoring form was the monitoring form was done at pace on unverified data by local authority finance directors providing their best understanding at the time that it happened. As you say, it then turned out there was a discrepancy with the formal reporting. I was never particularly bothered about that because, consistent with the discussion that we had earlier about certainty of funding, actually providing local government with more funding than it needed at any point in time was not wasted funding, because in essence, local government funding is something that is repeated every year. So I felt more comfortable personally providing more money and recognising that some local authorities were overfunded than the opposite, which would have been they would have been underfunded. And there was a judgment to be made about if you use a formula-based approach, inevitably some local authorities will get too much and some local authorities will not get enough. And it's about drawing that balance. And inevitably, if you're trying to avoid one, which is local authorities not having enough, you run the risk of providing some with too many. And we obviously had the exceptional financial support scheme, which was for local authorities that didn't have enough. But the design of it was that it was exceptional. It was not to be generalised, and therefore it was important to ensure there was enough funding in the system.
And in terms of overfunding, are you making the point that there would then be another year of funding to follow, and that overfunding would be recouped or balanced out over time? Is that the point you're making?
Absolutely. So if you look at the unring-fenced reserves that local authorities had, they rose from somewhere in the region of 25, 26 billion up to about 35 billion and have now returned to something like 30 billion. So effectively what happened was, as you say, overfunding went in, and then government actually has provided significant funding after the pandemic, but has been able to reflect the funding that was provided in the pandemic in the decisions that were made subsequently about the levels of funding.
If you didn't have the level of monitoring you did, how would you have picked up on the overfunding that subsequently transpired? Would it have been more challenging if you'd have had a lighter touch level of monitoring and returns?
So you would have found the overfunding would have appeared in the official statistics. One, the official statistics are less frequent, and secondly, they come with a time lag. So effectively, we would have been blind to the situation until it had come up in the official statistics. And the risk obviously then would have been not that there was overfunding, but there was underfunding, and then we wouldn't have known, and then we would have put delivery by local government at risk.
And we know, in contrast to the position with English local authorities, that in Scotland, the Scottish Government did not collect financial monitoring returns, though COSLA did organise some of its own data collections. As competing approach, and the justification was it's too onerous on local authorities, wanted them out delivering services. You've seen what happened in England and how monitoring went. Where do you sit in terms of, in a future emergency, monitoring is a good thing, or light touch, no monitoring, can all be done by established relationships?
I am very strongly of the view that monitoring was an important part of the response. That isn't to say that the other things that you've described, the informal contact, the feedback from local government, potentially in a more qualitative sense, is not important, but I think the monitoring forms were absolutely essential.
Okay. And I just want to pick up on that point, the other thing I mentioned, because some of the local government witnesses we heard from in the inquiry last week were keen to point out that, yes, monitoring of quantitative data is important for central government to ensure engagement with local authorities, but that also there needs to be engagement with local authorities in the sense of what is actually happening on the ground. So not just looking at data, but conversation and communication. And I just wonder, just for you to ponder on that, how would you achieve that in a situation where there are 317 local authorities in England? And it sounds like a great idea, but what's your experience as to how that can actually translate into reality?
So I agree with you. Having 300 plus local authorities does make it a challenge to connect with each and every one of them. I think it's recorded in the NAO's report on local government finance under the pandemic that the local government finance team and MHCLG more broadly had contact with around a third of all local authorities. But the way that we attempted to answer that question is, from a local government finance perspective, is we set up a group who were the presidents of each of the different societies. So London treasurers, metropolitan treasurers, county council treasurers, district council treasurers. That group was a pre-existing group. It had met probably every 2 or 3 months prior to the pandemic. And then under the pandemic, we met weekly or on occasions daily. That was very important in terms of getting feedback from, if you like, a representative group of the sector. It's also the case that under the pandemic, we continued the engagement that we had with local government more broadly. So that was less, if you like, that was less systematic in the sense of we might talk to one local authority one week and another a different week. So I think we struck the balance of having a dedicated group that we worked with intensively, and then a much broader group who we had more occasional contact with, but who provided us with feedback. I think the other thing it's worth saying is that across the directorate, individual members of the directorate would have had connections with local government, and we got an enormous amount of feedback during the pandemic about what was working and what wasn't working. And also, we very actively worked with local government in the design of the schemes that we were implementing. So it wasn't just about feedback after the implementation. It was also about what we were intending to do and how we could make sure that we were designing it in a way that meant it worked for local government.
So as far as your department's concerned, it seems that from your perspective, you're getting good data through monitoring, you're using pre-existing frameworks that tap into representatives at all different levels of local government, and you're also having ad hoc conversations as well.
Yep.
As well as having within the department people who have a long experience of dealing with local authorities. Is that right?
Correct. And in addition to the local government finance team, who obviously would lead on finance, there were other parts of the department who, for example, led on local government engagement or resilience and emergencies, and then as you went to the permanent secretary, the director general, there were, for example, the meetings of the regional 9. So I think, as a whole, the department had a very strong engagement with the local government sector under the pandemic, and I think that provided us with an enormous amount of feedback that we found very useful.
I want to move on to a different topic now, which is, if you like, the delay that there sometimes was between the announcement of funds and the guidance then being issued that was relevant to how those funds should be used. Now, I don't want to ask you questions about topics that aren't within your remit, but we'll pick this up as a general issue. You're aware, I think, of the COVID Additional Relief Fund, CARF?
Yes.
Is that right? And we understand, and I'm using this as an example, it was announced in March of 2021, but the guidance became significantly delayed. There were various iterations of the guidance, and I think the final version was dated December of 2021, so several months after the funding was announced. I'm not asking about the specifics of the scheme, but taking that as an example, what sort of challenge would that place on a local authority if they get an announcement but they don't have the guidance at the same time?
So I think they've been well illustrated by the evidence that you've had, which is that oftentimes people who were potential recipients would say, well, I would really like the money, so can you tell me what it is and how I claim it? And they would say, well, actually, I don't know because I'm waiting for the guidance. In respect of the CARF, there was actually a very specific explanation. So I think that probably was the most delayed of all of the guidance. And the reason for that was because at the time of the announcement of the CARF, the government said that the issuing of guidance would be dependent on the successful passage of the Rating and Directors Disqualification Bill, because essentially the CARF overlapped with the material change of circumstances that businesses were making. And so the government said, well, first of all, we need the legislation to prevent the material change of circumstances claims, and then we can issue the CARF. So in that particular case, there were reasons why it took so long. But your broader point, which is, were there negative impacts from a delay between announcement and guidance? Yes, I think there were impacts.
Yeah. And why, I mean, that's a specific example, but in other examples, there are delays between funds and guidance. Why was that happening? Was that just because the pace at which things were moving? Was it that there wasn't time to work up the guidance? It was more important to make the announcement? Could you just give us your perspective?
I mean, if I think about the guidance that we issued, so primarily that guidance was not binding. So we were issuing non-ring fence grants. So effectively, local government could do what it wanted. So the guidance, if you like, in those circumstances was not that material. In the cases where the guidance was essential, I think there was a tension between making the announcement and the work that then needed to go in to work through the details. And some of that, as you say, was literally about the pace at which the work was taking place. I think some of it was also about working practices and who was able to input and work on guidance in advance of an announcement, and where the announcement had to happen first, and then people could really begin to get to grips with producing the guidance.
Yeah. Can I just unpick that second part of your answer? Working practices. Do you mean working practices in the department, or in local authorities, or do you just expand on what you mean, these working practices that cause that sort of problem?
So in a number of cases, and I think you've seen this in evidence, the responsibility for the design and delivery of a grant was split. So in some cases, for example, the Treasury had responsibility for the design of the policy, BEIS had responsibility for the delivery, and MHCLG provided expert input. And so in those circumstances, then if, for example, the grant was part of a budget process, then there may have been issues around who was told what and when because of budget protocols.
And by budget process, you mean the budget
Yes.
that the Chancellor of the Exchequer
Correct.
announces on the floor of the House of Commons, that budget. Yeah, not local authority budgets.
No.
Okay. So that's one example. And so where different departments were involved, one driving policy, one perhaps delivery, one as an expert advisor, that's where you tended to see this separation perhaps of announcement from guidance and the scheme actually going
So
live?
I think there are a number of examples that you see in the evidence where issues were first brought to departments, the department who would be responsible for the guidance, potentially 24, 48, 72 hours before the announcement. And so that limited department's ability to produce the guidance. So there was, for example, in the case of the hardship fund for council tax that we were responsible for at the beginning of the pandemic, the proposal from the Treasury came on the 10th of March to the department, and the announcement was on the 11th of March at the budget. That 24 hours made it difficult to get guidance out. Now, under those circumstances, we did actually get guidance out within a few days after the budget, but it inevitably took us time to produce the guidance.
Now, accepting all of the reasons for that, confidentiality, speed of response, emerging situation, if you're doing this all again, what could you do to take some of those rough edges off? I mean, are there streams of responsibility that could be looked at, and or aligning policy with the department that's actually implementing, or what would your suggestions be, having been through this?
I mean, it is very hard because, you know, as you were living the pandemic, it literally felt that each day was bringing new issues. And so people were working at incredible pace. But my reflection would be that if, for example, as we discussed earlier, if there were another pandemic and we had done more preparation in advance, we would have a greater understanding of which levers we would use and what grants we might use, and therefore we would be able to do a lot more of the work further in advance. I then think there is a question which I think as a government we should always ask ourselves, which is, are we applying the right level of secrecy or confidentiality? Are we being as open as we can be in the production of the policy, to ensure that we can bring in people who can give us expertise and allow us to, as you say, reduce the gap between announcement and guidance? Because if, for example, we had been brought in to some of those things earlier, that would have allowed us to have reduced the gap between when the announcement was made and when the guidance was finally produced.
I will come back to this later on in questioning, but just to pick up on some of that now. You talked earlier about you having very good levels of trust and openness with local authorities as a department, that you had pre-existing and developed even further during the pandemic. So if that was there already with your department, was one of the difficulties really bridging the gap between your department and those other government departments? You had that relationship, but they didn't with local authorities.
Yes. So ultimately, each local government department, each government department has responsibility for the policy area that it looks after. MHCLG had expertise in local government, and for the areas that we were responsible for, I think we took exactly the approach that you've just described. We could then support other government departments with the expertise that we had and with the offer of the connection to local government. And some departments had that at the beginning of the pandemic, some took some time to develop it and developed it over the pandemic, but ultimately that was a decision for them. So I think, as you've seen in some of the other evidence, for example, on business grants, at the beginning there wasn't such a close, one, there was a tension about how quickly the policy was developed, but secondly, the connection between the department and local government was not as close, I think, as it was in the case of MHCLG.
I mean, generally speaking, did you tend to find that local authorities and the people you were dealing with, the representatives, these were reliable people who could be trusted? They understood confidentiality?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And did you ever find it frustrating that you wanted to bring them closer into the design of policy, but other departments who perhaps didn't have those sort of relationships or experience were reluctant to do that?
Yes, but I think I recognise why that was the case, because I think one of the advantages of the way that we had worked prior to the pandemic is we had established those relationships and that level of trust. And so that naturally flowed into the work under the pandemic. I think if you hadn't have had that, then I think there may have been a natural caution on the part of a government department to say, well, we don't know these actors particularly well. There are risks about being very open. There could be a leak. Information could get out that was market sensitive. And so we need to be cautious about what we do. So I think part of my answer to your question would be to say there is probably only so much you can do in the heat of the moment of the pandemic. The work should be done prior to the pandemic in terms of establishing the relationship, so they are all there at the point that the pandemic happens.
Right. Well, that neatly brings me on to the next topic, which is essentially looking at emergency financial response frameworks. So how you might plan now to put yourself in that better position to have a framework. And first thing I'd like to ask you is a sort of general question, picking up on the evidence we heard from Dr. Leunig, who was economic advisor at the Treasury, who favoured a sort of, to an extent, an anti-planning approach. In other words, intellectual agility is what is required. You don't need a lot of plans and framework. You need to react to the situation. Overarching question, are you on the agility side of the pendulum, or are you on the planning side of the pendulum?
I think I would put myself somewhere in the middle. So I think there is a very sensible amount of planning that you can do in advance. I think you can over-engineer the planning, and you're absolutely right. You need an agility to respond. So at the beginning, we talked a little bit about the component parts and the building blocks. If I were responsible now, I would want to understand the building blocks. I would want to understand the levers I was going to deploy. I would want to leave the question of which lever, when, by how much, with who, open. But if you like, I would want to minimize the amount of ambiguity and uncertainty going into a pandemic, so that, if you like, I was then just left with the essential decisions which could only be answered in the pandemic.
And in fairness to Dr. Leunig, I'm probably overstating his position, because I think he did go on to say and support the idea that you can plan your architecture, you can plan your relationship frameworks and so on and so forth, but you leave the actual decisions to reaction to what is happening on the ground. Is that where you sit, really?
Yes, I think the only thing that I would add is that I think processes will only ever get you so far. So I would, in addition to processes, I would also think about the culture. So what are the ways of working? How do we engage local government? What is our approach to openness, as you just described? What is our approach to risk? So I wouldn't just look at the what, I would also look at the how.
Right. Now, the inquiry understands that the department's conducted lessons learned exercises, as you would expect, and I'll come on to some of those. But do you therefore favour yourself having this emergency framework that can be taken off the shelf in a future emergency?
Yes, I do. But consistent with the point that I just made, I don't think it's just about having a document.
No.
It's about how do you make that, how does that document live? So for me, I read I wasn't there, but I've read the documents. I think the question that it leaves for me is, okay, but what's the engagement that you're having with local government now in advance of the next pandemic, so that when you do pull that book off the shelf, you not only have the processes, but you also have the people and the relationships in place to make a success of the response.
Now, I suspect I know, therefore, the answer to my next question, but I'll ask it anyway. How important is it to have the local government association and local authorities involved at this stage, looking ahead at those issues, understanding how things might work, ensuring those relationships are there?
I mean, I'm sure it's happening, but I would say it was essential. I think that in order to prepare for the next pandemic, you have to have the key actors in the room.
Moving on slightly to central government and sort of joined up working in central government, we've already touched on in your evidence these strong relationships you had with local authorities. In a sense, your department is the voice of local authorities in central government. Do you agree with that?
I do.
Yeah. You are the sponsoring department, if you like, who has this 317 local authorities. They feed into you, and then you speak on their behalf to other central government departments. How did you find there was, or to what extent was there joined up thinking and working between your department and the other big departments that were players here?
Yeah, so the division of responsibility is that MHCLG, as you say, is the sponsor department for local government, but individual departments take responsibilities for specific policies. So I know this has been discussed before, but for example, the Department for Health and Social Care has responsibility for adult social care, the Department for Education has responsibility for children's social care, and so on and so on. Prior to the pandemic, we had very good relationships with most departments. I would say that the strength of the relationship was proportional to the importance they played in the local government finance system. So, for example, within the local government finance directorate, we had a team that was specifically responsible for supporting DHSC and DFE on adults and children's social care. And then we had nominated points of contact for other government departments for example, transport, waste, and so on. So I would say that we had good links into other government departments and good ways of working prior to the pandemic.
But if you would give yourselves marks out of 10 for how you engage with local authorities, did you see that other departments were not receptive to engaging with local authorities, that it varied department to department, that some viewed them as trusted partners, others didn't? Or what was your experience?
I think it is fair to say that different departments took different views about their level and the nature of the engagement that they had with local governments into and during the pandemic. My personal view would be to strongly encourage all government departments to develop the strongest relationships possible with local government.
Yeah. Now, again, that sounds like a great idea. How does it work in practice? We're talking about central government, big machine. How structurally could you make that work, other than just saying everybody should talk to local authorities and trust them? What could you actually do?
So I don't think I have an exact parallel, but where government feels a particular thing is particularly important and worth pursuing, then they can either legislate to make it happen, or they can issue guidance to government departments saying that their expectation is that it should happen. So it is not a parallel, but the family test exists. And that was a commitment from a previous government that said the family is really important. And now every government department, when you formulate policy, you need to think about the impact that it has on the family. I wouldn't want to stretch that too far. That is non-legislative, it's non-statutory. I think in essence it's a comply or explain basis, but effectively what it does is it pushes consideration of the family up the agenda in what can sometimes be a very crowded space.
And given your department is effectively the voice of local authorities, I suppose, would that give you a bit more heft in terms of delivering their voice to other departments? If you're able to say, look, you have a requirement, an obligation to think about local authorities and how they...
Well, so there are a number of examples. Again, they're not perfect parallels, but there are a number of examples where the department has exactly some leverage or some heft with other government departments. So, for example, the new burdens process, that is a responsibility that sits with MHCLG, and there is a process that needs to be gone through. It is not perfect, and it doesn't always deliver the outcomes that you might want. But in broad terms, that means that other government departments need to consider the impact of a change in policy on local government finances and their costs, and then needs them to engage in that process. I think what we're talking about here, though, is something broader, because I think, again, coming back to my point, I would be nervous of just saying, well, there's a new form that needs to get filled out, and therefore that is the answer. Ultimately, I think this comes down to the individuals working in the area understanding the value of engaging with local government, as we did in MHCLG, I think, under the pandemic. I think the process can be helpful, but it needs to be complemented by, if you like, the approach of the individuals concerned.
Yeah. So a lot of this comes down to building relationships, changing attitudes, encouraging inclusivity with local authorities when decisions are being made.
Yes.
Right. So there's a cultural element, a government culture. Right. You're nodding, but I think it needs to be a yes or no.
Sorry, yes, I agree with you. I think culture is important.
All right, okay. Can we move on to playbooks that have been developed? Because I think this, again, is something you've touched on, and I want to pick up on it with you. The two playbooks, the MHCLG Pandemic Playbook and then the Financial Shocks Playbook. And I'm just going to ask that part of the Pandemic Playbook is put up. So this is INQ 000 625 658, pages 27 to 29, and it's the section entitled Local Engagement, Local Government, including Mayors. There we are. I'm just going to read part of this into the record. As demonstrated during COVID-19, local authorities play a critical role in responding to pandemics. Their local leadership, knowledge of communities, and ability to quickly adapt and design services to meet local needs puts them at the forefront of response. From public health protection to economic growth, the expertise of local authorities is vast, meaning they can help tackle the full range of potential impacts on local people, places, and the economy. Just pausing there, those are all things that your department knows very well already. Do you agree?
Yes.
And in terms of wider government and culture and relationships, I mean, really, that's the message that other departments could do with understanding. Is that fair?
I would support that.
Yeah. So that's just not an important lesson learned for your department. It's an important lesson learned for all government departments, how effective a partner local authorities can be.
I would hope that any playbook from any government department which touched on local authorities would have similar text.
Yeah. And then if we can have the next section, please, for any future pandemic response. MHCLG will have a key role in emphasising to OGDs, other government departments, the importance of early engagement and co-design with local authorities, particularly where it is possible that local authorities will lead or support delivery. Just pausing there. Again, that sounds great, but I mean, that's saying what you should do. It doesn't actually tell you how you would do it, does it? I mean, isn't it the how that's important?
I agree the how is important. I think if I was being, the other thing that I would pick out is that this is not about the actions that are taken when the pandemic happens. I strongly believe these are actions that need to be taken in advance and considerably in advance, because culture is one of the slowest things to change, ways of working. And so what I would be suggesting, and I'm sure that it is in government now, is that I would be taking this and I would be doing this now. So that when we got to the point of the next pandemic, all we were doing is we were just strengthening and building on relationships and ways of working and processes that we already had. We were not creating new ones at the point of the pandemic.
So these should not be aspirations for what you do once there is a crisis. This is what you should be getting on with and doing now to make sure that when a crisis occurs, everything is in place.
Absolutely.
Right. Can you think of any benefit to not including local authorities in the design of this playbook and inviting them to contribute to writing a playbook like this?
So there may be some sensitivities about some of the information in the playbook, but I think I would return to the point that I made earlier, which is we should really challenge ourselves. Every time we say there's a sensitivity, we should challenge ourselves to understand whether it really is a sensitivity. My personal preference would be to be open. It may be that ultimately local government wouldn't see all parts of every playbook, but I think your general point, which is should local government be involved and should it understand in broad terms what the playbook is, I think the answer is yes, because I think part of the success would be to have a shared understanding going into a pandemic of what was likely to happen, and I think that's difficult if you don't share the playbook.
Yeah, I mean, you've stressed earlier in your evidence how important having an open and trusting relationships with local authorities are, and one view is that not engaging them in the design of a playbook for future emergencies might tend to undermine a sense of openness and trust. Do you agree with that as a general proposition?
Yes, subject to my point about there may be very good reasons on occasions not to share all of a playbook because of particular sensitivities. Yes, I agree with that.
And I don't want to overstate what you are saying, but I apprehend you're making the point that you should, as the department, challenge yourselves as to, is this really sensitive? Is there actually a need to keep this private and not involve our partners in local authorities? Is that how you would approach decision-making? Self-challenge? Can we actually share this?
I mean, I personally find it a good way of working. I think what it does is, I think sometimes we are overly cautious as government about what we share with other people because we're nervous about the consequences. And I'm not saying there are times when it is absolutely right to be cautious and we can't share information, but I would encourage sharing information with local government. And I think the other thing, returning to the point that we discussed earlier, is under the pandemic, we demonstrated that we could work with local government in a very open and transparent way, and they respected that confidentiality. So in the entirety of the pandemic, we did not have a single occasion in local government finance where stuff that we had discussed with local government and asked to be kept confidential did not remain confidential. So I am confident that if you ask local government to respect that confidentiality, they would respect that confidentiality, because ultimately this is to their benefit, and they know that if they don't respect that confidentiality, then one of the consequences will be they will not be involved in activities like this, which are crucial to them.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to move on from playbooks only because I want to cover some other ground with you.
Right.
And, I think you've made, if I may say so, under that playbook, the points that I was going to ask you about. So let's move on a little to business grant schemes. And I just want to really, through the prism of business grant schemes, pick up this point a little further about engagement and engagement with departments other than your own. Now, the inquiries heard from the Local Government Association and local authorities a more critical analysis of the way that the Treasury and the Department of Business engage with them during the economic response as compared to your department. And we've picked up this point that you're the voice of local authorities in central government. Were you doing your part to try and persuade those other departments that they really needed to engage during the emergency? Or was it not really working like that because things were happening so quickly, there wasn't the time?
So where we knew about something, we would have made the point about the value of engagement. Well, I think there are two things. One is, under any circumstances, we would have taken the knowledge that we had of local government and represented local government and made the points about, for example, the potential design implications of a particular proposal and whether it would or wouldn't work in local government. So we would have done that under all circumstances. It's also the case that we would have, as a matter of course, encouraged another government department to engage with local government. I think you're right. I wasn't personally involved in the business grants in great detail, but having read the evidence, it's clear that there was enormous time pressure and that at some points information was shared with BEIS at a very late stage, which then made them engaging with local government more difficult than it otherwise would have been.
Is there any element here of a sort of pecking order of departments, that the Treasury is an extremely powerful department and your department in comparison wasn't as powerful, and therefore there's a sense in which it has to be subservient to the Treasury? It isn't willing to sort of stand up for itself? Is that your experience?
No. No. I think where we had engagement with the Treasury, and I know that we did, and where we had concerns and we knew about them and shared them with the Treasury, we would have shared them with the Treasury. There were circumstances where those concerns were acknowledged but were not actioned, but I think I think we were always effective in representing local government under the pandemic. But ultimately, the decision about the design of a scheme or the implementation of a scheme would have sat with the relevant department.
I just want to pick up a specific example of really linked to this point. And I preface this with, I don't think you're on this email chain, but I just want to use it to illustrate the point. Could we have INQ 00661243? And this is an extract from an email. My initial thinking was also this would be easier if we gave LAs more discretion, but perhaps with some guidelines about what kind of criteria we think they should use, and any thoughts about how we could be more specific about what we think LAs might be able to achieve, whether they would welcome the funding or criticise us for expecting them to do the impossible. Do you know if we did anything like this in the past? And then underneath, can we see there at 5.12, there's a reply. I think it's hard to call how they would react. I think the more cumbersome you make it, that's they being local authorities, and the more pressure you put on LAs to do it quickly, the harder it will be. New burdens, funding might grease the wheels. If you were being critical of that conversation, you might say, well, rather than wondering how they might react or wondering how they might find it, just ask them. And I just wonder, do you think sometimes that there wasn't an approach whereby this rich resource of experience was tapped into? There was a sort of assumption, well, we'll make the decision and see how it lands, rather than just asking them. Is that typical or not?
I mean, if I remember rightly, so in this specific case, as you say, this was a Treasury policy. So this would have been subject to Treasury protocols and ways of working. This was in the run-up to the budget, so it would have been covered by budget processes. We had a long-established way of working with the Treasury on that, which is effectively, we provided them with, if you like, expertise, but we did not we did that on a closed list, so we were not at liberty to engage local authorities. I think it's also the case that the 7th of March 2020 was a Saturday, and this was for the budget on the following Wednesday. But your general point, which is, would injecting... I think, remembering the other things on this list, I think what you did see is that officials from MHCLG did share what they thought the impact on local government would have been. So the first role I talked about.
Yeah.
The bit that I think you are saying is, well, were local government directly involved? I think in this case they were not. In principle, do I think it is good to involve local government in the development of policy? Yes. In this specific case, would it have been possible and appropriate? Without getting into the details of the particular case, I wouldn't want to say, because, as I say, this was done in the run-up to a budget. I don't know what else was being discussed and therefore how appropriate it would have been. But I think looking ahead, if you like, one measure of success would be that we didn't have an email like this in the next pandemic, because we would broadly understand the systems, the levers that we would be using, and therefore we wouldn't be need to having a discussion like this.
I mean, putting it bluntly, I might ask you, do you think sometimes that process got in the way of common sense? That the need to follow government process and procedure got in the way of the common sense of just picking up the phone and asking the question?
So I would hesitate to say that. I think what I would say is my principal position is that the involvement of local government is a good thing and will improve the quality of the policy that we are making. So I would, in principle, I would always say that local government should be involved. Taking that circumstance by circumstance, you need to understand precisely what was happening at the time.
And presumably, Mr. Skinner, you would say HMT are likely to say it wasn't just process. There are good reasons why you have a tight circulation list when it comes to a budget and the impact on markets and the like.
Yes, that's absolutely true. But, for example, prior to the pandemic, the Treasury had been considering reform of the business rate system, and they had established a working group in a run-up to a fiscal event, which involved certainly representatives of the sector. I can't remember exactly which local authorities or which representatives they were, but they had established that. So I think my point would be consistent with my point about we should challenge ourselves about exactly when and where we say it cannot be discussed. Do we generally mean that? And sometimes there is a trade-off to be made. I am confident in them respecting the confidentiality. I think then the question is well, what is the benefit involving local government? And I think we're saying they can bring a lot to the table.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier in your evidence a panel that already existed, which had representatives from different types of
Yes.
local authority. I mean, accepting you can't speak to 317 local authorities, is there a role for that sort of panel in a much more reactive way? So when a policy is being worked up, that panel can come in and provide advice and guidance and help you in terms of how it might land?
So that is exactly what we did. In the directorate that I was responsible, that's exactly what we did. So the monitoring form, a lot of co-production, as we thought through the tranches and the various sales fees and charges scheme, the local tax guarantee scheme, the exceptional financial support scheme, that is exactly what we did. I think one of the advantages for us in those circumstances was we were responsible both for the design of the policy and the implementation of the policy. So we brought those two things together. So if you like, we internalised some of those rough edges that you talked about previously.
Yeah, we've heard in another context that where the Treasury and HMRC, for example, were responsible for policy and delivery,
Yes.
so they could bring those two things together, things tended to land much better where policy and design was brought together. So that's what you were trying to do. Where it was in your gift to bring local authorities closely into the delivery of policy, you did. Is that the position?
Absolutely.
Right. Can I move on to another topic, which is league tables? Now, this was April 2020, data being published by central government regarding the proportion of allocated funds that have been paid out to business by local authorities. It became known to some as a league table, if you like. Mr. Jenrick, in his statement, INQ 0003 661484, paragraph 80, says, my view is that a league table was both appropriate and helpful. Grant schemes are of little use if they did not find their way quickly to the business which needed their support. As above, there was a real risk that without support, businesses would simply disappear from local communities. Goes on, that would have been disastrous for those directly involved, and if at sufficient scale for LAs as well. Now, it may be you agree completely with this, the balance of that paragraph, but do you agree with the first line of it, that a league table was appropriate and helpful in achieving that which follows, or preventing that which follows?
So I think that the way the information presented was subject to significant discussion, and a lot of that discussion was to avoid it being seen as a league table. I think I understand why the table was produced. In fact, people who worked for me did the calling to find out the answer. I think, as I said in my statement, while the intent is entirely understandable, which is to bring transparency, to understand the performance of different local authorities, the important thing is then to match that with the understanding of why different local authorities were paying out the money at different rates. So there were reasons that some local authorities were quicker than others. So first of all, it was based on an estimate. It depended on the proportion of of businesses that you had the data for. It depended on the degree of checking that you were doing in advance. So I think my addition to this would be to say, I understand why there was a league table. I understand the benefits it could deliver. I think in having, not a league table, in having a publication of the information, the important thing is to match that with the data and the explanation of why that is the case. Because otherwise, I think the risk is that for each local authority that you correctly identify has or hasn't paid out grants, you have another one for whom there are very good reasons that they perhaps haven't, and that explains why they are taking longer, or vice versa.
I mean, we heard some evidence from Leicestershire Council about the diverse nature of business in their area, the number of businesses, so on and so forth, and that it was never going to be fair to compare their delivery of support to a neighbouring council that might have a fraction of the businesses and a much more straightforward set of businesses. So is this the danger of unintended consequences, really? It looks like a league table and people are being rated and criticised for not coming higher up the league, and that's not necessarily going to be fair.
Yes, and I think at the time, local government was trying to do a lot of things. And so I think the question is was the benefit of the publication of this information without the explanation, which then led to criticism of local government, some of it justified, some of it not? Do I think that there were costs to that? Yes. Do I think that could have been helped by taking an approach where more information was provided alongside the numbers which explained why local authorities were doing it? Yes, I think it would have done.
I mean, the danger presumably is that people who really are doing their best in difficult circumstances feel demoralised and feel that their efforts are being misrepresented by the crude statistic.
Yes.
Right. Which presumably isn't a very good thing for this spirit of openness and trust that's so important to exist between the department and those delivering.
Yes, but at the same time, I would say that the value of this publication is it did allow us to then to marry this information together within the department, and then I think that did help us because we could talk to individual local authorities and understand what the challenges and opportunities were, whether they could get the funding out more quickly. And I think overall the intent was to get this money out as quickly as possible, and so actually having that understanding was helpful.
So the data was helpful, the purpose of gathering the data was helpful, but there was the unintended consequence of how it was presented, essentially. Is that fair?
I think what I would say is having the information was helpful, making sure that that you didn't just rely on the raw data, but you also understood the drivers behind the performance was important to have a full understanding of what was going on with individual local authorities.
If you looked ahead to the delivery of grants that the Department of Business and Trade was, as it now is, would be responsible for, their forward-looking lessons learned and their playbook acknowledges that local authorities are going to remain a critical delivery partner and encourages engagement. But again, can you give us any insight as to how, it sounds great, how that should actually happen in terms of how they should be engaged by other departments?
I mean, on the specifics of pandemic preparedness, I think it would be valuable, and I know this is happening, to run exercises about a potential pandemic that involve local government to make sure that they are involved. But as I say, I think processes only get you so far. It's then building the relationships and having the relationships with local government that means that you then really understand both the world of local government and you appreciate the value that they can add.
I'm going to move on now to sort of general lessons learned and reflections for the future in the time we have available, because I want to give you an opportunity to share any particular reflections you have and best learning, having managed these relationships or been closely involved in them. But just picking up on that last point, I was going to ask you about the experience we've heard in Wales.
Yep.
Now, obviously, there are less local authorities, but we understand that in Wales there is something called the Finance Subgroup of the Partnership Council for Wales, which is a regular forum for engagement on finance. It existed before the pandemic, chaired by a minister, 9 council leaders sitting on the group, nominated by the Welsh Local Government Association. And if you look at reported surveys, I'll just ask if this is put up, INQ 00653255. Thank you. Paragraph, there we are. Almost 3/4 of English authorities thought that central government engaged not very or not at all well with local government in the design and implementation of business support schemes. By contrast, 86% of Welsh authorities felt that the Welsh government engaged very or fairly well with them. Now, accepting there's a scale difference here, significant scale difference in terms of the number of local authorities. Is there learning that you can draw from that experience in terms of having a pre-existing engagement group? Or would you say, well, we've got a pre-existing engagement group, but we're just dealing with a lot more local authorities? Or how do you bridge that gap?
So I think the Partnership Council and the Finance Subgroup were ministerial and political, so they were ministers and local politicians. We do not, as far as I'm aware, we do not have, or at least we did not have the same statutory equivalent in England. That doesn't mean that local government and ministers didn't speak frequently. They did, but I think your scale point is very important, because in essence, you could fit the whole of Welsh local. You could have every leader of a Welsh local government, of a Welsh council, in a large table. If you wanted to have the English equivalent, you would need to hire a conference centre. And so by definition, I think that does make it more difficult. And as we've described, at an official level, I think we just had to have engagement with a selection or a sample of, rather than the population of. But this, I'm afraid, I wouldn't want to speculate on this because I wasn't involved in business grants, as you know. So I wouldn't want to comment on the details of why these numbers were these numbers.
All right, thank you. So, Mr. Skinner, thank you. Those are the things I wanted to cover. Do you have any additional reflections or learning that you wanted to share with the inquiry? We haven't.
I think we've touched on a lot of it. I think one issue that came up last week was this tension between consultation and speed of delivery. And I wanted to reflect on the fact that it comes back to a point that we have discussed, which is, yes, in a literal sense, there is a tension, because if you're having some consultation, then however long that consultation lasts means that you can't do it. But in practice, do I think that that meant consultation was not possible? I do not. I think that the key question was to design the consultation in a way that was consistent with the timescales that you were working to. So on a number of occasions, I had to have relatively brief conversations with individual representatives of the sector because it was a Sunday morning and the policy that was being discussed needed to be ready for Monday. I think that added value, and what that meant is I couldn't have done a full consultation as we would have done in times that were out of the pandemic, but I think it added a lot of value nevertheless.
Right. Thank you very much. My lady, those are my questions. I don't think there are any other questions.
There aren't. Mr. Skinner, you talk about consultation adding value. Your evidence has added value. Thank you very much indeed. You've been extremely helpful, and I'm very grateful to you, and of course also to you and your colleagues for what you did during the pandemic. So thank you very much indeed for your help.
Thank you.
I shall take the break now and return at midday.
Thank you, my lady.
That's right.
My lady, can I check again that you can see and hear us in the hearing room?
I can, thank you.
Thank you. Then I call Sir Charles Roxburgh, please.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Sir Charles, you are the former Second Permanent Secretary to His Majesty's Treasury, is that right?
Correct.
And you've provided a statement to the inquiry, and I'll give the reference INQ 000659764. We understand, Sir Charles, that you joined the Treasury as Director General of Financial Services in 2013 before becoming Second Permanent Secretary in July of 2016, a position you held until June of 2022. Is that right?
Correct.
And as Second Permanent Secretary, you were the second most senior official in the Treasury during the pandemic. Is that right?
That is correct.
The first Permanent Secretary at the time was Sir Tom Scholar, but your obligations and duties were to oversee the department alongside Sir Tom Scholar. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you were a member of the Treasury's Executive Management Board, sometimes abbreviated to the EMB, which set the strategic direction of the department. Do you agree?
Correct.
You had oversight of various functions within the Treasury in addition to that. Is that right?
Yes, I should clarify that my policy responsibilities focused on what are called the Economics Ministry functions within Treasury. That comprised 5 directorates, 2 of which were focused on financial services and 3 of which were focused on the enterprise and growth agenda for the Treasury. So that was 5 of the 15 policy directorates were the ones that I was involved with in terms of policy development and advice to ministers.
Thank you. And you, in your capacity as Second Permanent Secretary, worked closely with all of the Treasury's Director Generals. Is that fair to say?
In management terms, yes, but not in policy terms.
Yeah, management, not policy. And the Treasury generally, whilst it is a powerful department in government, it's actually a relatively small department. Is that right? Quite close-knit.
Correct. It's about 1,700 people, and at all times I found it a very collaborative and inclusive group, and we were a very strong and unified senior team throughout all my time there, but particularly through this difficult years of the crisis.
Indeed, you set out in your statement how, in your view, officials worked effectively and constructively as a close team.
Absolutely.
The first topic I'd like to ask you some questions about, Sir Charles, please, is transparency and engagement. And I preface these questions by accepting, or the questions accept, that there are circumstances in which the Treasury needs to be guarded in terms of information it will share. That's either because of market sensitivity or because there may be a budget or another fiscal event. So there are certain limitations to the ability of the Treasury to be transparent, even if it wanted to be. All right, so I take that as a given. But notwithstanding that, the inquiry has received evidence about concerns that the Treasury did not engage as widely as it could have done at times, and sometimes was not particularly open. And the inquiry's expert, Dr. Tetlow, in her report, has described the Treasury as often being guarded in the way it shares information and intelligence with other departments and the wider world. Now, just pausing there, do you accept that description that the Treasury is guarded in that way? And if you do, is that for the reasons that I've prefaced the start of the questions, or for other reasons?
Well, having spent most of my career outside the Treasury and now having left over 3 years ago, I think I can bring a degree of objectivity and detachment in my perspective on this issue. And I can talk with most conviction and with specific evidence in relation to those areas in which I had direct personal involvement. And based on that evidence, I believe that Treasury worked very well with other departments, and we were not guarded and we were not secretive. We actively sought out to work collaboratively with other departments. We reached out for expert input from across government and outside of government. And I'm happy to give you multiple examples of how we work constructively with other departments, with other arm's length bodies, and with our delivery partners such as the British Business Bank and the Bank of England. And I think we worked very collaboratively with all those. And I was very pleased to read in their witness statements that my colleagues in those other departments and arm's length bodies also said that their relationships with the Treasury were generally open and productive. Now, inevitably, there were some times where in the urgency of a crisis, some information wasn't shared as quickly as some of our colleagues in other departments might have wanted. But this was a crisis where things happened at rapid speed and the Chancellor was making decisions very rapidly. So there were some times when people felt that they weren't fully in the loop, but that was never deliberate. It was never our intention. And my overall conviction is that, from my experience, the Treasury worked collaboratively with all our colleagues across government and in arm's length bodies.
So from your perspective, if others have formed the view that the Treasury is guarded in its engagement with others, that isn't a view that you share. If it's an impression that's created, it's not one you meant to create.
I cannot argue about what other people may have perceived. That is their perceptions. What I would say is that I would not accept a general description of the Treasury as being secretive and guarded, because in my direct personal experience, that was not how I experienced, not how my colleagues elsewhere in government experienced working with me and my teams on many issues and many of my other colleagues. And I think there are multiple examples of really great collaboration across government and with delivery partners. In fact, Dr. Tetlow, in another report she did for the Institute for Government, called out how well the Treasury worked with delivery partners such as HMRC and the British Business Bank.
And indeed, we'll look at some of those relationships, and the inquiry has heard evidence that in particular, in terms of the policy partnership that existed between HMRC and the Treasury, there was a very constructive working relationship. So please don't proceed on the basis that we're not picking up the good examples of close working.
But could I just mention that the policy partnership is a very specific relationship between HMRC and the Treasury. That is not the only example of where we had really good working relationships with the bank, with the British Business Bank, with UK Export Finance, with UK government investments, and with multiple government departments. So I would not accept that you need to have a policy partnership in order to have a good collaborative relationship, because we had many such good collaborative relationships with multiple departments and multiple arm's length bodies.
When it comes to economic policy, do you accept the proposition that the Treasury is, in terms of setting economic policy, closed off?
It is a long-standing principle of the British government, dating from the days of Gladstone, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is the key cabinet minister with responsibility for economic policy making. Now, on many specific issues around economic policy, which is a very broad topic, advice would go to the Chancellor from Treasury officials, having worked very closely with colleagues in other departments. But the ultimate decision maker on the government's overall economic policy, and this has been true throughout modern British economic history, is the Chancellor of the Exchequer working closely with the Prime Minister of the day to implement the government's economic policy.
And really, I think you've answered the next question, which is that if there is a sense in which economic policy is closed off, that it sits with the Chancellor, that's because that's where it sits. As a matter of fact, the Chancellor is responsible for setting economic policy, ultimately. Is that right?
That is how our British system of government works, yes.
Exactly. So if that's the perception, it's correct.
But I wouldn't want you to think that we develop policy in isolation of other departments. There were many major policy issues that I worked on where the advice went to the Chancellor and was included in, for instance, a budget statement where we had developed that advice working collaboratively with the Bank of England, with the British Business Bank, or with Department of Business or Department of Transport, depending on what the policy was. We worked very closely with other colleagues to develop the policies, although the decision maker on those economic policies was the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Now, Sir Charles, we know that during the pandemic, and for many years, you kept a personal diary intended to be entirely private, of course, but you have properly shared it and extracts with the inquiry. It's a typed document, but I just want to put up one of those extracts which goes to this point, because I think it makes probably the point you've just made. So this is INQ 00549339, page 97. And we see there in that paragraph, this is from the 4th of June 2020, everyone wants to contribute to economic policy making, but the reality is that the Chancellor of the Exchequer controls it. That's why it's fun to be in the Treasury. And if you want to do economic policy making, that's the only place to be.
Well, I'm happy to answer your question on this, but if I could just maybe go back to your opening statement about my private diary and put that in context.
Of course.
I did keep a personal diary during this period. It was intended to be an entirely private document. I had not shared it with anyone until I started preparing my witness statement for this appearance. I had no intention of publishing my diary. It was, I had hoped, an entirely confidential document written by myself and no one else. As I wrote in my witness statement, these entries were written late at night, often after long and stressful days. They lack perspective, distance, and balance, and have never been checked or verified. They reflect my views in real time. Many of those judgments now look mistaken or poorly informed. And when we return to future extracts from my diary, I may well return to that statement because, as I say, it's a private document, and I put in my witness statement, I do not consider it a reliable source of evidence for this, but that is for the inquiry to decide. Now, going to this specific question, yes, this comment here reflects, I think, two things. One, it was an enormous privilege to work at the Treasury throughout my whole time there. It was incredible to be able to work with the Chancellor of the day in providing advice to shape British economic policy. It was an extraordinary privilege. And yes, if you want to do that, you should be in the Treasury. Just as if you want to advise on foreign policy, you should be in the Foreign Office. Or if you want to advise on transport policy, you should be in the Department for Transport. So at one level, this is a statement of the obvious, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is the ultimate decision maker on economic policy. And if you want to advise the Chancellor, you should be in the Treasury.
The reason, Sir Charles, I'm drawing attention to this entry and have asked you the questions about economic policy and the Chancellor's function is really to allow you to make the point that you just have, that the Chancellor is, as a matter of our constitutional settlement, responsible for setting economic policy. And therefore, as you have made clear, if there is a sense in which it's closed off and the Treasury makes policy, that's because that's what it's there to do. That's what the Chancellor's responsibility is. Is that the position?
I wouldn't accept your closed off point, but I would accept the point that the Chancellor is the ultimate decision maker on economic policy.
Yeah. And as I've said, there may be very good reasons why, from time to time, the Treasury can't share information. Examples might be risks of market abuse, risks of leaks, other reasons of constitutional significance. But do you agree that there were times where there was area for improvement, in the sense that the Treasury colleagues could have communicated better the direction of travel and what the Treasury was doing, and, second part, explain from time to time why you couldn't share information for those sorts of reasons?
Well, if I could pick up one of your points about whether having market-sensitive information meant we couldn't share it with other departments. In fact, that is not the case. I dealt with some extremely market-sensitive information concerning specific companies that were facing financial distress. And we worked on those very confidential cases collaboratively with the relevant department, Department for Transport, Department for Business, or the Ministry of Defence. And we had insider lists covering those departments with people who could have access to the information. And in those cases, most of my colleagues on EMB did not have access to that highly confidential information. So that is an example of where we absolutely did share confidential information with colleagues across government because they needed to know. I did not share it with colleagues in Treasury who did not need to know. So I think that illustrates that we really did work across governmental boundaries in departments when we needed to. To your point as to are there specific areas where we could have communicated better, it's always an easy conclusion to say we could have communicated better. When I think at the loan programs that we worked on very closely with Department for Business and the British Business Bank, I think we communicated very well. In the early days, things were moving incredibly fast. To illustrate that, the Chancellor made the decision to launch the first loan product. He made that decision on the evening of Sunday, March the 8th. And it was announced in the budget of Wednesday, March the 11th. I immediately confirmed to my colleagues in the British Business Bank and BEIS that the Chancellor wanted to make this announcement. So it was a very tight timetable. And maybe some people in those departments felt that we could have told them sooner, but we didn't have a decision until Sunday evening before the budget. So could we have done better? Possibly. I cannot think of specific instances where I felt we really dropped the ball on these programmes that I was working on.
The reason I asked the questions, Charles, is because you dealt with it in your statement at paragraph 11.5, when you identified yourself areas for improvement and said that senior colleagues in the Treasury could have done a better job of communicating with senior colleagues in other departments. And also, you said and explained why there were limits in your ability to share information more widely. And you gave the example of the risk of market abuse from sharing material price-sensitive information or breaking confidences ahead of a major announcement. Do you stand by that part of your statement and accept that for what are good reasons, you could not always share information, And do you stand by that part of your
Yes,
statement?
and in fact, when
Can I just finish the
Sorry.
question? Do you stand by that part of your statement that also says you could have done better at explaining to other departments why there might be reasons not for sharing information in those sorts of circumstances?
Yes, I said it's always possible to communicate better. And when we talk later about the working group, the Economic and Business Strategy Review Group for Permanent Secretaries, that group we could not share information with because it was not on a need-to-know basis, it was not relevant to them. So, yes, I stand by that, and I'm sure we could always communicate better. What I found, though, with the departments that we worked really closely with, Department for Business, Department for Transport in particular in this crisis, they fully understood those constraints because they were working with us on a number of areas. But I think more broadly, for colleagues who weren't working with us on these issues, that's probably where we could have done better.
So there might be a department that had a particular interest in a particular company. To take an example, it would know about this sensitive information. You would work closely together. Information would be shared. But there might be other departments who wouldn't have that sort of close relationship, and you might have, in those sort of circumstances, been able to explain better why there was sensitivity. Is that fair?
Yes. And if someone had asked me, I would have explained.
Yeah. Now, can we pick up then the Economic Business Response Strategy Group, which you did establish, is that right? And it consisted of permanent secretaries from other departments. Could you just explain why it was established, what its purpose was?
I did not establish it. It was established by the Cabinet Office, and it was established at the beginning of April. At that stage, and this was about a few weeks into the crisis, the Cabinet Office set up 3 groups. One was a ministerial decision-making group, the Economic Business Response Implementation Group, EBRIG, and that group was supported by a group of officials who prepared the papers for that group. And separately, they created a permanent secretaries forum, which was called the Economic and Business Response Strategy Group, brackets, permanent secretaries. And that was set up by the Cabinet Office, and they asked me to chair it. And it was intended to be a forum for permanent secretaries with responsibilities for different sectors of the economy. And it was the idea to meet in an informal setting to share information and intelligence about what they were seeing in the economy. It was not a policy formulation group. It had no defined outputs. It did not make any recommendations. It did not link into the ministerial decision-making group, EBRIG, as it was called. It did not review and approve advice to ministers. It was simply an opportunity for senior colleagues to share views as to what they were seeing in the economy.
And I think you say in your statement that you found it was not a particularly effective forum, and attendance petered off really over the summer of 2020, and the group was stood down. Is that right?
Correct. And
I'm just keen to explore why it wasn't a particularly effective forum. Is your view really that having meetings where you simply share information just leads to meetings for the sake of meetings rather than decisions actually being made and things being progressed?
Yeah. Well, early on, I think it was helpful, and I was keen to make it a success and to make good use of my senior colleagues' time. And I think some of the early discussions were helpful. But over time, the usefulness did decline. And I think that was because just information sharing is quite an expensive way to spend time. And there were other fora for information sharing, Wednesday morning colleagues and the Cabinet Secretary meetings as well. So the lessons that I drew out from that, similar to yours, were that meetings to share information have a limited usefulness and should not be duplicated. And we had multiple meetings to share information by this stage. And secondly, if you want to get senior people together, they need to have an output, something they need to work on together and have a deliverable. This meeting did not have that. And third, in a crisis, it's good to set up new structures but it's also good to shut them down when they finish their purpose. And so I do not see it as a problem that this meeting finished its usefulness and we didn't restart it. That's just the way things work in a crisis.
Yeah. So it's good to test whether a new structure can add value. A new fora can add value, but if it doesn't, it's right to shut it down because it's a drain on your time and resource, really.
Yes, and my senior colleagues had made that decision themselves because they stopped attending in person and started to send delegates.
Yeah, because they're picking up the information that was being shared through other fora that they're attending or have delegates attending in any event. Was that
yes,
what you were finding?
Permanent secretaries are extraordinarily busy people at any time, particularly this time, and appropriately we're prioritising how they spend their time.
Yeah. Now, you said earlier that obviously you can't speak for others and their perception of how the Treasury operates. We've heard evidence that the perception of some others is it wasn't particularly open and collaborative. You disagree with that strongly. There we are. But let's look at this the other way. It's very easy for people to say you need to be more open and collaborative. Sounds like a great idea. I'm more interested in whether you have any reflections about going forwards, whether there were other forums that could have been established, other means of communication that weren't tried and tested, or do you think you went through different iterations of groups and setting up forums and then closing them down again? And where do you sit with that?
Well, I am in a long career in the public and the private sector. I have learned that what's really effective in organisations is not the formal structures, the formal mandates to force cooperation, the documents to say Department X should cooperate with Department B. What really matters is personal relationships. And therefore, what I try to do with my teams at the Treasury, and they were really good at this, was to encourage them to build broad external networks outside of the Treasury, across Whitehall or in industry, depending on what the focus of their policy area was, and to build those personal networks of relationships, which are valuable in good times, but in a crisis are absolutely invaluable. And so, to give you an example of where I think I could have done better at building those networks was with the devolved administrations, which I know is an area that you are interested in, and that although we had some formal meetings with officials from the devolved administrations, and in fact, together with the permanent secretary at Bays, we held 2 briefing sessions for senior officials from the devolved administrations, and in early 21 I held a roundtable for Scottish CEOs. What I didn't have in either the Scottish or the Welsh civil services were any senior colleagues that I knew personally that I could pick up the phone to. I did in Northern Ireland with Sue Gray, who is the permanent secretary of the economics ministry there. And so when Sue faced a problem, she could pick up the phone and I could link her to the right team in the Treasury to get it fixed. I never had a call like that from Scottish civil servants or from Welsh civil service. So is the answer to that more formal structures, more coordinating committees? I think not. In retrospect, I should have invested more time in building personal relationships with the senior civil servants in Scotland and in Wales.
Yeah. We heard this morning some evidence from Alex Skinner, who was at the Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government, about, in his view, yes, it was important to have, if you like, off-the-shelf schemes and systems for a future emergency, but he also stressed that relationships are key, and that having relationships, good relationships in place are important. And that seems to be what you found, where you had a pre-existing relationship that enabled communication. You gave the example of Sue Gray, is that?
Correct, in Northern Ireland.
And I think you give that example in your statement. There was a particular issue that arose. Sue Gray was able to contact you directly because you had that pre-existing working relationship, but it was the working relationship that had pre-existed that enabled that sort of interface between you. Is that fair?
Correct.
Yeah. Now, just looking at that critically, it might be said that the danger of that is it's so personality dependent. You know, if you've got somebody who's been in a job for a long time, worked in public and private sector as you have, has made these connections, then you're in a good place to have those sort of relationships. But what if you don't?
There's a certain level of serendipity about it sometimes, yes, but you can work on it. And I can give you 2 examples of how we worked on it. With the Bank of England, I put this in my statement. When I joined in 2013, relationships between officials at the bank and at the Treasury were not particularly good. The relationship between the governor and the then Chancellor were very good, but the officials had a slightly more difficult relationship. But the 2 senior teams from 2013 onwards made an explicit effort to build and strengthen those personal relationships when Governor Carney was the governor. And then later, when Andrew Bailey became the governor, Andrew Bailey, and this was during the COVID crisis, had a task force of Treasury officials and bank officials work on how we could strengthen it still further. So although it did depend on the personal relationships that we had at multiple levels between the Treasury and the bank, you can work on those relationships and you can invest in them. And if they are not good, it's a responsibility of senior management, as the Treasury leadership and the bank leadership decided to do, to strengthen them. So it's not pure happenstance. You can work on it, but you work on it in ways that allow people to form the personal relationships rather than just leaving them to happen to chance.
And you appear to be envisaging their relationships not just at permanent secretary, second permanent secretary level, but throughout the organisation, so that people have relationships with their relevant counterparts at whatever level they find themselves in the organisation. Is that how you envisage it?
Yes, and with our major partners, whether it's the Bank of England or a big department like Bayes, and it'd be true for other colleagues who had the relationships at HMRC or with DWP, we would think about all of the relevant officials, who was their point person, who was their opposite number in the bank or in the Department for Business. And it was part of their job to get to know them, build relationships with them, both on policy content, but also to build some personal rapport with them. And that was very important.
But the direction of travel in terms of the importance of building those relationships has got to come from the top of the organisation, hasn't it? It's got to be trickled down from the top, that this is what you need to be doing.
Yes, and you do that. The tone at the top is vitally important both ways. And when Alex Chisholm became permanent secretary at Bayes, which was almost exactly the same time that I became second permanent secretary, I remember going over to his office and we sat down and we said, look, these 2 departments have not had a great relationship under the coalition government. We need to set a new tone. And we both agreed that we would, from the top, set a new tone, that we would not speak disparagingly of the other department. We would not deliberately say anything that was slightful of them, but instead would try to really emphasise to our respective teams the importance of working together. And Alex and I did that in 2016, and that stood us in good stead, because by 2020, I think the relationship between Bayes and Treasury at multiple levels was very strong.
Looking ahead, it might sound like a recommendation that everyone should just be nice to each other and get along very well, which obviously wouldn't actually land or be possible to enact. But is it about also seeing, when you build those relationships, that the positives that can be drawn from them, and remembering that in terms of corporate memory, that where you build these relationships, this is how it actually improves delivery, therefore that's why they need to be maintained?
It's not about being just polite and nice to each other. I had some very robust policy debates with colleagues at the Bank of England, very robust, because we were different organisations with different objectives, but they were always respectful, always fact-based, and always driven by our desire to get the right outcome against our objectives and ultimately the right outcome for the country. And it's actually often through those difficult discussions where you're approaching a common problem with a different perspective that you form a really deep trust-based relationship. So it's not just about being nice, it's about working constructively and positively, solving problems together. Now, in terms of what's the recommendation, as I say, I instinctively do not like lots of structural recommendations with committees and mandates, because that isn't how you drive organisational change. What I tried to do in my time as a senior civil servant, and I saw other people doing this too, is it's about coaching and encouraging the next generation of civil servants to develop that external orientation, the ability to get out of their office and go and build relationships across Whitehall, in industry, with arm's length bodies. And that requires coaching. It requires you giving them feedback when they're doing it well or not. And it becomes part of a senior civil servant's job to be externally focused and to build these external relationships.
To what extent, in your experience, was the tone set not from the civil service, but from the politicians that sat above that? I don't want to get into political issues, but if there is a difficult political relationship, did in your experience that put strain on the ability of officials to communicate?
It did in respect of the Scottish Government, to be candid. And it was a difficult time in the political history of this nation in the years following the Scottish referendum. The Scottish Government was still committed to independence. The civil servants working for the government were duty-bound to serve their government, and so that did put a strain on it. In more normal times, in Whitehall, there might well be difficult relations between two secretaries of state or between the Chancellor and another Secretary of State. That happens in almost every government, to my experience. And the job of the civil service is to work through those difficulties and not to let any political disagreements get in the way of effective cooperation.
You discussed sharing information with other departments, including sensitive information, and you spoke of information not being leaked. But it's also right, isn't it, that sometimes information was leaked and you were concerned about that?
Yes.
What effect did that have on the willingness of yourself and colleagues to share information going forwards?
Well, leaks, as I put in my statement, leaks are an endemic problem in government, and it's been true in all the governments that I served in my 9.5 years at the Treasury, and I'm sure it's still true today. And it does cause problems. Leaks undermine trust, but they are part of life in governments. There's no point wishing them away. The practical consequence of it was that we became extremely careful about how we shared information and how we managed the information protocols around it. So in my statement, I talk about a process that we called Project Birch, or Special Situations, which was handling the really sensitive company-specific information. And we could not share that widely, but we had to keep the Prime Minister informed of it. So what we agreed with Number 10 is that there would be one person in Number 10, Eddie, now Lord Lister, and one official who were in the loop, and they would brief the Prime Minister, and no one else in Number 10 could have access to that information. And like that, that meant that we really limited. Equally, we had exactly the same type, it wasn't a comment on Number 10, we had exactly the same restrictions on who could know that in the Treasury.
The Treasury side.
And so the Chancellor knew, but other ministers did not know. Just because this was such sensitive information, we had to keep it on a very tight restriction. So that's quite easy to manage, because you can, with that market-sensitive information, wrap it in very tight secrecy, necessarily. The more difficult leaks are the ones where people leak information that just undermines trust. And some of those leaks happened. They were deeply regrettable, but that's a fact of life in government, and I wish they hadn't happened.
And again, this may be one of those areas where it's easy to identify a problem, but totally impractical to come up with a solution for how you stop leaking or briefing in government, I would imagine, Sir Charles.
I have no idea how you stop that problem.
No, all right. Can I move on to topic of experts? And I don't mean experts in the inquiry, but I mean engagement with experts by the Treasury. Now, one suggestion that Dr. Tetlow has made is that the Treasury could explore more formal or establishing more formal expert networks so that the Treasury has access to a panel of experts. But would you say that those already exist or existed, or do you accept that could be developed?
Well, why don't I tell you what we did, and then I'll tell you why I don't think Dr. Tetlow's recommendation adds a lot of value to what we were doing. So the teams that I was working with reached out extensively to experts elsewhere in government and outside of government. And to give you specific examples, we reached out to experts in small business lending, in the British Business Bank, in UK finance, in the lending institutions, in the Bank of England, a whole range of external experts on small business lending. In credit risk management, we reached out to external firms like McKinsey, who provided expert analysis on credit risk, but we also created a whole new panel of experts on credit risk called the Advisory Credit Committee, where we found the people in government who had deep expertise on credit, having served in investment and commercial banks, and formed a credit committee to advise the Chancellor on some very complex, difficult issues. So we created that for this. We formed it in a couple of weeks, and it was extremely powerful. And then we stood it down when its time was finished. And we reached out to experts in other very specialised forms of finance, preferred equity, collateralised loan obligations, or specialty lines insurance for the event scheme and TV and movie production restart. And so what we found was that we could get access to the experts we needed when we needed them with a couple of phone calls. And if we needed them for a one-off bit of expertise, that was fine. And if we needed to create a standing committee, as we did for the Advisory Credit Committee, we could do that. And I've done that throughout my career at the Treasury. I created similar panels of experts for reviews that I led on financial regulation in fixed income, on patient capital, on infrastructure finance. We created expert panels to review on those specific policy people. So I actually don't accept this view that the Treasury doesn't reach out to experts, because I spent my 9.5 years doing exactly that, as did many of my colleagues. And the reason that I don't support Dr. Tetlow's recommendation is, first, I think it's unnecessary because we were doing it and did it repeatedly throughout my time at the Treasury and in this crisis. And I think it's unhelpful. First of all, you never know the precise expertise you are going to need. I had no idea that we would need an advisory credit committee because we were taking on £100 billion of single name credit risk. I had no idea we'd ever need that.
Just pausing there, I mean, you may be underlining why you go to experts, which is there's a particular area that is outside your everyday experience, and so you bring in that expertise. And are you saying, Sir Charles, really, that you needed to be flexible about this and to have an ad hoc approach if a particularly complicated issue arose that needed that external expertise, you would bring it in, rather than having a sort of standing committee that
Correct.
may not actually possess the skills that you needed?
Correct, because sometimes if you've got a specific policy issue, as I explained on those policy reviews, or this credit risk issue, you create what you need with the expertise you need for that issue. What I struggle with is how we could define even one expert panel for each policy directorate. There are 15 policy directorates. You can't define one panel for each of them, because take financial services, you need a different panel for banking, and within that you need a different panel for retail banking versus investment banking, a different panel for wholesale insurance versus retail insurance versus life insurance. You'd end up with a plethora of panels, and each one takes work. You have to recruit people, you have to screen them, you have to clear their conflicts, and then if they don't get used very much, they get frustrated. So I think this is a lot of work which would have added no value in this crisis. And you can solve it by identifying where you need the expertise and for how long, and creating the structures that you need for that policy problem.
And is there any need for those structures to be, in any sense, pre-existing? Is there any merit in having at least a pool of people identified in advance, or is it very much see what the problem is and go to the people who are current in the expertise at the time you need it?
I would leave that to the policy leads for the particular area. So if one policy lead said, look, we have repeated need for expertise in this defined area of economics, which is a highly variegated expertise, so there are lots of different sorts of economics, but we need expertise on this particular bit of economics on a regular basis, I'd have no problem with having a permanent committee of that type of expert if the policy lead said we need that permanently. In the areas for which I was responsible for, we needed a lot of external expertise, but the need changed, and we didn't have the need for a standing committee of experts and couldn't actually have maintained it.
No. And was there a risk, in your view, that a standing committee could become stagnant, effectively, not actually providing you with the particular advice you needed? There'd be a danger you'd go to your standing committee and it may not actually have all of the strands of expertise that were required.
Well, one of the things about expertise these days is how incredibly narrow it is.
Yeah.
So if you had for instance, when we worked with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport on restarting the events business in the UK through an insurance scheme, you're not looking for an insurance expert, you're not looking for a specialty lines expert, you are looking for the one or two people in the market who underwrite events insurance. There's no way you're going to have that expertise on a standing panel. So I completely agree that the Treasury needs to be outward looking. It needs to build it, senior officials need to build their networks so they can get to the experts in one or two phone calls. And there may be some areas of expertise where it's useful to have more people involved for longer periods. But I think a very rigid structure of panels and a roster of approved experts would have been highly constraining in this crisis. And we'd have ignored it. We'd have gone round it to the people we needed to talk to.
So you accept, I think, that you need to do some thinking about this in advance because, as you say, you don't want to be modern day getting out the yellow pages and looking through to see who you could call, but you don't want to have pre-existing panels, rosters, people pre-approved. It's a balance of flexibility depending on...
I'm not at the Treasury now, so that would be a decision for the current leadership of the Treasury. All I can do is to comment on my experience from when I was in the leadership of the Treasury, and it would not have been helpful to me then.
Can I move on to a new topic, which is the initial response to the pandemic? So this very early response. And I'm going to start questioning where Module 1 of the inquiry left, with this conclusion in the Treasury's corporate statement that the Treasury accepts the inquiry's recommendation in Module 1 around the government needing to assess a wider range of scenarios around national risks and the need to consider the economic impacts of emergencies and responses on the population. It goes on, had we prepared for a wider range of scenarios during the period 2017 to 19, we might have had a more well-developed set of responses on the shelf. I hope that in a future crisis, future HMT officials will be able to draw on the full suite of interventions that now exist and which need to be kept up to date and fit for purpose. And set that out as background, and it's important, Sir Charles, to acknowledge that you and your colleagues were faced with an unprecedented situation. There were no off-the-shelf schemes of the sort talked about there. That there was no playbook, for example, of what a job retention scheme might look like, how it might be delivered. And this was an economic crisis unlike any that had been experienced before. So we take all of that as a given in these questions. We also, I suppose, add into that Mr. Sunak had become Chancellor of the Exchequer only on the 13th of February of 2020, so was newly in that post, and asked for advice at that stage as to the likely or anticipated impact of the pandemic that I think was given on the 26th of February. And at that stage, the advice was focusing on two competing scenarios that were being postulated as potential scenarios. One was that this outbreak of COVID-19 would be largely contained in China, so it wouldn't really be a problem that reached the United Kingdom, or at that stage that we were looking at potentially a 4-month-long pandemic affecting 25 to 50% of the workforce, in which it could be predicted that there'd be 2 weeks off work per worker. And that was all based on the reasonable worst case scenario that SAGE was advocating at the time. And therefore, at that stage, based on that advice, in fact, we'll have this put up on the screen, I think. It's INQ 000 625746. I'd like, please, paragraph 23, which is on page 5. Yep, there we are. Sentence in bold, but after that, for budget, we have resisted creating a fund for COVID-19 related activities, as this sets a bad precedent. And while departments are raising risks to their spending teams, but have so far not put a figure on pressures. And in addition, while the scenarios and any response are still very uncertain, we expect, subject to scale, situations like these will be addressed from the 2020-21 reserve in the first instance. And so that was the initial position in February. And policy options were discussed in this paper, including really pre-existing routes of support at that time were being envisaged. So HMRC's time to pay arrangements and arrangements like that already existed. These were, would you agree, based on the SAGE estimates at the time and the predicted worst case scenario, that these were policy options that were never going to stand up to what in fact emerged in the pandemic?
Well, yes, that is a statement looking back with what I think you called in your opening statement artificial perfect hindsight. I think the test is what could people be expected to be thinking at the end of February based on the best advice we were getting from SAGE. And based on that advice and that realistic worst case scenario at the end of February, where there were still only 19 cases in the UK and we were being advised by the health experts that containment would work and would be the strategy to pursue, based on that, the economic analysis was suggesting a relatively modest economic shock where GDP would fall between 0.6 and 1.3% of GDP. That type of economic downturn is well within the Treasury's normal range of ability to respond to. Now, what we did not know was that from the end of February, we were about to enter the most sudden and dramatic health crisis and economic crisis, which unfolded over 2 to 3 weeks when we went into lockdown on March the 23rd. That was an extraordinary period where we received every day more and more negative surprises on the health side and on the economic side. And yes, policy responses developed in 1 week were overtaken by events within days, which is why we had to respond so fast and constantly raise our standards set by the Chancellor for ever larger interventions to respond.
Yeah. And your interventions were increasing incrementally as the health conditions worsened and as worst case scenarios got worse. So there was a constant need to reconsider and react to events that were going on around the world. Is that the position?
Yes. Well, the first announcement was in the budget of March the 11th, which at the time seemed quite a comprehensive response, but within days was overtaken by events.
Can we just go back a little before that? You mentioned this in your statement, that you put it as the Treasury moved decisively into action on the 28th of February.
Yes.
And I'm just going to ask that this is an entry from your diary of that date, which I think refers to a meeting you were asked to convene. So it's 28th of February 2020. There we are. Dan YS, that's Mr. York Smith, is that right?
Correct.
Asked me to convene a meeting of HMT seniors as the Chancellor of the Exchequer is worried that we're not reacting with enough urgency on coronavirus. Call a meeting for 4 p.m. We don't need the name. Now, HMT seniors, is this people of your sort of level, permanent secretary level, director general
Well, there
level?
are two of us at my level. It would have been the director generals and the directors.
Yeah. And so this is coming from the Chancellor asking you to convene this meeting, really to step the response to the pandemic up
Yes.
the agenda, essentially.
Correct. I mean, to put this in context, the Chancellor had the previous afternoon, on Thursday the 27th, he had commissioned advice from the Treasury. This request went out at 2 p.m. He had commissioned advice for a comprehensive budget package to respond to the crisis, covering health spending, statutory sick pay, business support and financial services. He had asked for that advice by end of day. The Treasury is working intensely to prepare that advice, which went to him the Friday afternoon. So I wouldn't want anyone to take away from that clip from my diary any sense that we were not working at pace. The Treasury was working at intense pace in response to the Chancellor's commission of the previous day.
But can we take from that and from what you've just said that although he'd only been in post since the 13th of February, on a personal level, the Chancellor quickly got to grips with the issue and was driving requirements from the Treasury as to advice, as to standing up schemes and so on and so forth?
Absolutely. The Chancellor was fully in the saddle, as they say, as Chancellor the morning after his appointment. There was not a single change of pace, and he slipped straight into being Chancellor, and the Treasury systems lined up there, and it really made no difference whatsoever to our speed of response. What he had done was to completely clear the slate of his predecessor's draft budget, and we went back to square one to develop a new budget for the March the 11th. And many of the issues that we had been working on for Chancellor Javid's budget were stood down.
And again, to put this into context, there was due to be a budget regardless of the pandemic, is that right?
Yes, March the 11th was going to have been Chancellor Javid's first budget, but when he resigned in the reshuffle of February, the budget date was there. We had to have a budget on that date, and so the Chancellor was preparing the budget, but decided to include within the budget a coronavirus response package.
But when we look at the pressures that everybody was under, the pandemic did not arrive after a budget, after that annual fiscal event had taken place. The budget was coming anyway, a lot of work to be done on that, and the pandemic alongside it. Just so we can understand the
It was an extraordinarily busy time, but then this was an incredibly busy and stressful time for almost everyone in the country. And we were just having to work hard. And however hard we were working and however much stress we were under, it was as nothing compared to frontline health workers at this time.
And I know it's difficult to comment on other people's reflections, but I'm having acknowledged it's difficult, I'm going to ask you to do it because I just want your view about this. This is there was a corporate memory project that the Treasury conducted, and Philip Davis, who was Director of Public Spending, spoke to it. I'm going to ask the INQ 00652953. Said in retrospect, if we could just find that. There we are. In retrospect, I think we were quite slow, as with the whole of government and outside of government, to recognise it was more than just an annoying health issue. I probably tried 3, 4, 5 times before it was necessarily resonated with my directors at the time, or DGs, to get some resources in for coordinating stuff. We were getting loads of stuff through, goes on. So in that initial stage, we should have jumped on it quicker. And across the SCS, we should have listened more. Do you accept that observation that there perhaps wasn't, and this isn't a criticism of the Treasury, this is just an observation as to how quickly the pandemic was developing, there wasn't an appreciation of the need to centrally coordinate from the outset and to move more quickly?
Well, I don't feel I can comment much on Philippa's statement. I have huge respect for Philippa. She was an incredibly valued colleague. I don't know quite what time period she's referring to here, whether it's from February the 28th or before February the 28th. But why don't I tell you what I think on these issues? I find it hard to believe that we could have started much earlier than when we did. You know, you could argue 2 or 3 days maybe, but that would have made no material difference because we would still have been working towards a deadline of March the 11th because that was the budget and that would be the date that the Chancellor was going to announce anything we worked on. So we might have had 2 or 3 days more to prepare the budget package than we did. And I think that would have made no difference to the proposals and measures that were introduced in the budget. I find it impossible to understand how we could have started work on the crisis response at the beginning of February. As I argued in my statement, that would have given us a month, but I just don't see how we could have done that. There was no health advice that we were facing a major problem at that point. I think, my personal view, is that from February the 28th onwards, we stepped up dramatically, and then we continued to step up further and further as more and more teams got brought into the work. The work for the budget was focused on a relatively small number of interventions, of which the loan scheme was on. So for me and some of the colleagues working with me, that was an intensely busy period because we had one of the major budget announcements to work on. Other teams did not, but those other teams, like the personal tax and welfare policy team, then got brought in to do what became known as furlough, and that team worked incredibly hard, incredibly productive, but they started a bit later. So my personal view is that we responded well and geared up rapidly from February the 28th onwards.
We know that the SPB effectively became the coordinating force under Dan York-Smith in the early stages, and then that developed again. But was that identified as the correct coordinating force in the Treasury, or did that just emerge organically, really, because they've been working on the budget, that it became the natural successor to that work?
It's the natural place to have this type of effort run from for 2 reasons. First of all, the initial response was a budget package, so it made sense to run it through this group, Strategy and Projects Director at SPD. But it was also the group in the Treasury that was very good at coordinating processes and project management and flexible resourcing. So it had a flexible resourcing pool within it. Yeah. And it wasn't a policy directorate in its own right, so it wasn't doing its own policy. Yep. So it was both the obvious one, but it was also the right one to have as the coordinating body for this. Now, in time, structures got built up and it became more of a sort of standing army on the COVID response. But SPB, and they did a very good job. They were the right people to respond and to coordinate the initial response.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sir Charles. We need to take our break for lunch now, I think, my lady.
Certainly, I shall return at 2:05. Thank you very much. Sir Charles, I hope you were warned that we wouldn't finish you this morning, but I promise you we will finish you this afternoon.
No, thank you very much. I'm expecting to be here for much of all of the afternoon.
Well, I hope you're being looked after.
Yes, very well.
Thank you.